It began in the shadows of 1943, the year the Allies realized that victory would not come by armies alone, but by intelligence. Deep within the corridors of Washington, a little-known organization, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, was quietly rewriting the rules of war. Their mission was unlike any before it: to infiltrate occupied Europe, sabotage Nazi industry, and uncover the secrets that could change the fate of the world. Among their most urgent concerns, whispers that Germany was building an atomic bomb. The operation, codenamed OSS, was led by Colonel Boris Pash, a former military intelligence officer, and directed by the brilliant physicist Samuel Goldschmidt. Their orders came straight from the highest levels: to find evidence of Nazi nuclear progress before it was too late. But to do so meant entering enemy territory, following trails that disappeared in the fog of war, and trusting intelligence that often came from desperate prisoners or intercepted radio chatter. By the fall of 1943, OSS teams followed in the wake of Allied advances through southern Italy. Small detachments, a mix of scientists, engineers, and seasoned commandos, crept into newly liberated towns just hours after the fighting stopped. They searched laboratories, universities, and mines, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that could determine the future of the human race. In Naples, they found a lab filled with empty chemical drums labeled uranium oxide, hastily abandoned by fleeing German technicians. In Rome, coded notes hinted at a shadow network of physicists under the Reich's protection, and one enigmatic name kept appearing: Werner Heisenberg. The closer they got, the more dangerous their work became. In late 1944, as Allied troops pushed through France, a forward Alsos team was ordered into Strasbourg, still under threat from retreating German forces. There, in the ruins of a university physics department, they made a chilling discovery: blueprints, test tubes, and journals marked with the insignia of the WWII. Reich Research Council. It was proof the Nazis had been close, far closer than anyone had admitted. But as they prepared to extract the materials, the team's field commander, Captain Henry Williams, reported strange interference over the radio. Static, then silence. The team vanished. Days later, a patrol found their abandoned truck at the edge of the Vosges forest. Inside were scattered notebooks, a broken Geiger counter, and the torn remnants of an OSS cipher sheet. No bodies were ever recovered. Official reports would later describe it as ambush under fire. But the details, the absence of bullet casings, the missing equipment, raised questions that would linger for decades. Were they captured by the SS or silenced to protect what they had uncovered? As Allied armies crossed into Germany in 1945, Alsos operatives raced the Soviets to every suspected research site. In Haigerloch, beneath a small church, they discovered the remnants of a German nuclear reactor, graphite blocks, uranium cubes, and a laboratory left in haste. It was here that the American scientist Samuel Goldschmidt finally confronted the truth. "They were closer than we ever imagined," he wrote in his diary, but still years away from success. Yet one page later, a note in his hand read only, "Some reports do not align." Even in victory, mystery remained. Certain documents retrieved from German archives were sealed indefinitely. Some suggest the missing Strasbourg team had uncovered something far more valuable than documents. Perhaps samples of enriched material, or a living witness to the Reich's atomic effort. The files, redacted in 1947 and never fully released, became the stuff of quiet speculation among intelligence historians. In the aftermath, Alsos faded into the classified archives of the early Cold War. The OSS itself would soon transform into the CIA, carrying forward its legacy of secrecy and sacrifice. But the lessons of those first infiltrations behind enemy lines, the courage of scientists and soldiers working side by side in hostile territory, set the blueprint for modern intelligence operations. Today, the names of those lost in Strasbourg remain engraved on a memorial wall at Langley. Their mission officially ended in success, but the silence surrounding their disappearance suggests that not all secrets of Operation Alsos were meant to be uncovered. Somewhere in the ruins of Europe's wartime laboratories, fragments of their story may still lie hidden. A reminder that in the shadow war for knowledge, truth itself was the most dangerous weapon of all. By the spring of 1944, the tide of war was turning. But for the Allies, the success of D-Day would depend on more than brute force. It would rely on chaos behind enemy lines, confusion sown among German divisions, and local uprisings timed with precision. To achieve this, the Office of Strategic Services joined hands with Britain's Special Operations Executive and the Free French Resistance in an audacious plan known as Operation Jedburgh. It was unlike any mission before it. Small three-man teams of elite commandos, one American, one British or French officer, and a local radio operator, parachuted into occupied France to train resistance fighters, disrupt communications, and relay intelligence ahead of the Normandy landings. Their motto was simple: surprise, sabotage, subversion. But for many, it became a one-way ticket into the heart of the Reich's deadliest territory. The Jedburghs were trained in secret at Milton Hall, a secluded estate in Cambridgeshire, England. There, recruits practiced demolitions, hand-to-hand combat, and coded transmissions while memorizing the terrain of France from aerial maps. They carried British Sten submachine guns, plastic explosives, and IS phone radios, short-range sets that could communicate directly with Allied aircraft. Each team also carried a cyanide pill. Capture by the Gestapo was not an option. On the night of Pascha, June 5, 1944, just hours before the Normandy invasion, the first Jedburgh teams leapt into the darkness over Brittany and the Loire Valley. Among them was Team Hugh, led by US Major William Colby, who would later become director of the CIA. Their parachutes bloomed silently over the black fields of occupied France, where farmers risked execution to guide them to safety. Within days, they were training local Maquis fighters to strike German convoys and destroy railway lines linking Paris to the coast. The impact was immediate. Bridges were blown, communication lines severed, and German reinforcements delayed by precious hours. But success came at a terrible cost. In the town of Choisy-le-Mauges, the local Jedburgh team, codenamed Team Marcus, was betrayed by an informant. The Gestapo surrounded their farmhouse hideout at dawn. For hours, gunfire echoed through the fields. When silence fell, the building was reduced to rubble. The bodies of 2 agents were found days later. The third, a French operator known only as Lucien, vanished without a trace. Survivors of other teams recalled hearing intercepted radio transmissions, German voices mocking Allied codes, as if someone within the resistance had been turned. The OSS later concluded that several Jedburgh teams were captured and executed in secret, their identities erased from German records. But fragments of diary entries recovered after the war suggest something more chilling: that certain teams had stumbled onto intelligence about internal SS power struggles and were silenced not by accident, but by design. Colonel Lucien Fayard, a French liaison officer, wrote in his after-action report, "Some of the men did not fall to the enemy. They were taken by shadows on our own side. There are things in this war even allies prefer buried." His words were quietly redacted from the official Jedburgh archives. Yet for all its losses, Operation Jedburgh accomplished its core objective. As Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, coordinated uprisings erupted across France. Trains derailed, depots burned, and German supply routes descended into chaos. General Dwight D. Eisenhower would later credit the French resistance, bolstered by the Jedburghs, with delaying at least 2 German divisions from reaching Normandy in time to repel the invasion. Still, many Jedburgh missions remained shrouded in uncertainty. In August 1944, Team Daniel was dropped into the forests of the Vosges Mountains to intercept SS communications during the retreat from Paris. Their last transmission read, "German column approaching, will engage." No further signals were ever received. Post-war investigators found their camp intact, weapons stacked neatly, food untouched, and no sign of a struggle. The mystery of their disappearance endures, buried beneath the chaos of liberation. As the front moved eastward and France was freed, the surviving Jedburghs faded into anonymity, their missions classified or forgotten. The OSS called it operational containment. Historians call it silence. But among the men who trained at Milton Hall, one saying endured, "We landed with 3, we returned with ghosts." In the end, Operation Jedburgh was more than sabotage. It was a test of trust, courage, and the thin line between freedom and betrayal. For every bridge destroyed, there was a comrade lost. For every coded message sent, a new question remained unanswered. The war was far from over, and in the mountains of Yugoslavia, a new OSS mission was about to push those limits even further, one that would test not only survival, but loyalty itself. By 1944, Europe was a fractured battlefield, and in the skies above Yugoslavia, American bombers were falling from the heavens like flaming meteors. Every week, dozens of B-17 and B-24 aircraft, crippled by flak or Messerschmitt fighters, went down behind enemy lines. The fates of their crews were grimly uncertain. Capture, execution, or slow death in the mountains. But one mission would defy all odds, uniting spies, airmen and guerrillas in a daring rescue unlike any other. It was called Operation Halyard. The story began in the summer of 1944, when the OSS learned of hundreds of downed Allied airmen hiding in the hills of German-occupied Serbia. They were being sheltered by villagers under the protection of General Draža Mihailović and his Chetnik resistance, a monarchist force once allied with the British, now entangled in the shifting politics of the Balkans. The intelligence was staggering. More than 500 airmen alive scattered across enemy territory awaiting rescue. Washington could not ignore it. The OSS assigned the mission to Lieutenant George Musulin, a Serbian-American operative fluent in the language and a veteran of Balkan intelligence work. With him was Captain Nick Lalic, a radio specialist, and Lieutenant Mike Rajatic, an interpreter and logistics expert. Together, they parachuted into the darkness above the village of Pranjani on August 2, 1944, carrying radios, rations and orders to bring the men home. When they landed, they found not a handful but hundreds of exhausted airmen, living in barns, haylofts and mountain caves. The locals had fed them for months, hiding them from German patrols at immense personal risk. "They gave us their last loaf of bread," one rescued pilot later recalled, "and they refused payment." The Chetniks, disciplined and wary, escorted the OSS men through minefields and forests, showing them a makeshift runway carved into a sloping meadow, a secret airstrip built by peasants with their bare hands. Against every rule of war, Mussolini decided to gamble. He radioed Bari, Italy, requesting immediate extraction. On August 9, 1944, the first C-47 transport plane descended under enemy radar, guided only by oil lamps laid along the grass. One by one, the stranded airmen were lifted from occupied territory in a series of midnight flights. By month's end, 512 Allied servicemen had been evacuated safely to Italy, the largest single rescue operation behind enemy lines in World War II. But as triumphant as it was, Halyard carried a darker shadow. Reports reached OSS headquarters that political tensions between Mihailovic's royalist Chetniks and Tito's communist partisans were erupting into violence. British liaison officers, now favouring Tito's faction, accused the OSS of aiding a force considered hostile to post-war plans. Within weeks, Washington ordered the Halyard mission classified and quietly withdrawn. Then came the first disappearance. Captain Lalic, returning to the region for a follow-up extraction in September, vanished en route from Bari. His aircraft, according to flight logs, never made contact again. No wreckage was found. Months later, local villagers spoke of a plane shot down near Foča, but no bodies were recovered. In OSS files, the entry reads only, "Status unknown." Lieutenant Mussolini himself was later reprimanded, not for failure, but for unauthorized collaboration. He had risked his career to save hundreds of men, yet the politics of victory overshadowed his success. "We saved them all," he said bitterly years later, "and they punished us for it." When Allied investigators returned to Pranjani after the war, they found the airstrip overgrown with grass, the village burned by retreating Germans, and many of the locals who had aided the rescue executed or deported. Among the ruins, a single OSS radio set was discovered, its battery dead, still tuned to Bari's frequency. The last transmission on its log sheet read, "Extraction complete, awaiting further orders." There were none. Today, the official account of Operation Halyard celebrates it as a masterpiece of coordination and courage, but declassified cables hint at missing files, names struck from rosters, mission logs redacted. Some researchers suggest that OSS personnel who remained in the Balkans were later absorbed into Cold War operations, their wartime actions concealed to protect shifting alliances. Others believe that the loss of Lalić and his aircraft may not have been an accident, but the first, quiet erasure of a mission deemed politically inconvenient. Yet, the villagers of Pranjani never forgot. In 2012, a monument was raised on that same meadow, its inscription reading, "To those who risked all to save strangers." Beneath it lie no known graves, only the memory of the men who vanished with their secrets. Operation Halyard was, by every account, a success. And yet its aftermath lingers as one of the great unanswered mysteries of the OSS. How a victory so pure could be buried so deep in silence. As the war moved toward its final, violent year, OSS commandos prepared to infiltrate even deeper into the Third Reich, this time into the icy heart of the Austrian Alps, where the next operation would test the limits of endurance, deception, and survival itself. In February 1945, as the Third Reich trembled on the brink of collapse, the OSS approved one of its boldest and most perilous missions yet, Operation Green Up. The target, Austria's Tyrol region, a vital corridor for retreating German forces, and the suspected location of top-level Nazi command movements. The mission's purpose was as clear as it was deadly: to infiltrate the enemy's mountain fortress and report on troop movements that could determine the war's final battles. The man chosen to lead the infiltration was Friedrich Meyer, an Austrian-born Jew who had fled to America before the war. Fluent in German, intimately familiar with Austrian customs, and fearless under pressure, Meyer volunteered to return to his homeland, not as a liberator, but as a ghost. Accompanying him were Hans Weinberg, a Dutch-born Jewish refugee and radio operator, and Franz Weber, a defector from the Austrian army who knew the Tyrol terrain better than anyone alive. Together, they would form one of the most extraordinary espionage teams of the war. Their insertion began on the night of Gibor, February 26, 1945, Oshu. Under the cover of a full moon, a B-24 bomber from the 15th Air Force flew low over the Austrian Alps. Meyer and his men leapt into darkness, landing hard amid the snowdrifts of the Ötztal Valley, just north of the Italian border. Below them stretched miles of glacial peaks, patrolled by German troops and cut off from all Allied contact. Their only lifeline was Weinberg's compact radio, a fragile device hidden inside a hollowed-out log cabin, capable of transmitting for only a few minutes each night before the Gestapo could triangulate its signal. Disguised as a German army engineer, Meyer infiltrated the nearby town of Innsbruck. Using forged documents and a daring confidence, he mingled with Wehrmacht officers in taverns and railway depots, collecting crucial intelligence on troop deployments, fuel shortages, and train schedules. He reported that the Germans were preparing to destroy bridges and tunnels, to delay the advancing Allies, information that would later prove vital to the US 7th Army's final offensive into Austria. Each transmission was a gamble. Weinberg tapped out coded messages in Morse, his hands trembling from the cold. Targets confirmed. Enemy morale low. Heavy movement east of Brenner Pass. His signals crackled across the Alps to OSS headquarters in Italy, where analysts deciphered them within minutes. Yet sometimes the radio fell silent, for hours, even days, leaving command uncertain whether the men were alive or dead. On March 20th, one such silence stretched for nearly a week. Unknown to headquarters, Meyer had been betrayed. A local innkeeper, suspicious of his accent, had alerted the Gestapo. Meyer was captured in Innsbruck, tortured and interrogated by the SS. Despite brutal beatings, he refused to reveal his mission or his companions. His captors, sensing his knowledge of Allied positions, dragged him before Gauleiter Franz Hofer, the Nazi governor of Tyrol. But instead of execution, something unexpected occurred. Hofer, realizing the war was lost, struck a deal. Meyer would provide intelligence about advancing Allied forces, not for betrayal, but for negotiation. It was a strange alliance born of desperation. When American troops reached Innsbruck in early May 1945, they found Friedrich Meyer alive, emaciated, barely conscious, but victorious. His information had directly guided the US 103rd Infantry Division's advance through the Brenner Pass, allowing them to link up with forces from Italy. Operation Greenup, despite every risk, was an extraordinary success, yet parts of its story remain clouded in mystery. After the war, OSS records noted that 2 transmissions from the Greenup team were intercepted by unknown stations, neither German nor Allied. The coordinates of those phantom signals pointed to remote valleys near the Zillertal Alps, an area later occupied by Soviet reconnaissance units. Some historians speculate that elements of the operation may have crossed paths with early Soviet intelligence, while others believe a second OSS detachment was secretly embedded in the same region, monitoring Mayer's progress without his knowledge. Even more unsettling were the missing field logs. Mayer's personal notebook, containing codes, contact names, and detailed reconnaissance notes, disappeared between his capture and liberation. When interviewed years later, Mayer said quietly, "They took the notebook when they took me. I never saw it again." The files were never recovered. To this day, Operation Greenup stands as one of the OSS's most successful and enigmatic infiltrations. Mayer and Weinberg survived, but much of their mission remained buried in classified archives until decades later. Their courage inspired the 2008 documentary The Real Inglorious Bastards, yet even that account omits references to the mysterious intercepted transmissions and missing reports. As the snows of the Tyrol melted in spring 1945, the war's end was near. But in the frozen passes of Norway, another OSS unit was already preparing a final act. One that would test not only endurance, but the will to sabotage Germany's last hope of resistance. It would be called Operation Ripe, and it would demand the ultimate price. By March 1945, the European war was entering its final violent crescendo. But in the far north, deep within the mountains of Norway, the Nazis still controlled a vital artery, the Nordland Railway, a lifeline that carried troops and supplies between central Norway and the collapsing Eastern Front. If those reinforcements reached Germany, the war might drag on for months. The OSS decided to act. Their last great mission of the European theatre would be one of the most daring and most deadly sabotage operations of the entire war. Its codename was Operation Ripe. The mission fell under the command of Major William E. Colby, a young officer who had already served in France with the Jedburgh teams. He was intelligent, quiet, and relentless, a man who believed in the precision of small unit warfare. Colby was tasked with leading a select team from the Norwegian-American 99th Infantry Battalion, men fluent in the language and hardened by Arctic training in Scotland. Their objective: parachute into Nazi-occupied Norway, destroy key railway bridges north of Jøsnosheim, and prevent the German 20th Mountain Army from retreating south toward Germany. On the night of GU, March 24, 1945, 2 B-24 bombers thundered low over the Trøndelag region. In their bellies waited 35 OSS commandos, heavily armed, faces smeared with grease, parachutes ready. As snow swirled in the moonlight, the green light flashed. One by one, the men leapt into the darkness, but fate struck immediately. One plane, battered by fierce winds, drifted off course and slammed into a mountainside near Majavat, killing its crew and most of the commandos aboard. The survivors of the second plane landed scattered across the wilderness, dozens of miles from their drop zone, in sub-zero temperatures. Colby's first task was survival. In knee-deep snow, he rallied his scattered team, building a base in an abandoned hunting cabin near Jevsjøen Lake, only a few kilometers from the Swedish border. They had limited supplies, radio contact with London that was intermittent at best, and German patrols sweeping the region daily. Yet morale held. "We were ghosts in a white hell," one survivor would later recall. "And we intended to haunt the Germans." Within days, Colby began reconnaissance. His men skied through blizzards, planting explosives under trestle bridges and supply depots. Their first major success came on April 4, 1945, when a section of the Nordland Railway was demolished, sending a German train plunging into a ravine. The explosion echoed through the valleys, confirming the OSS's presence and drawing swift retaliation. German troops, including elements of the Gestapo's and WWII mountain police, began hunting the saboteurs. In one chilling incident, a Norwegian villager later testified that German patrols found ski tracks leading toward a frozen lake, only to discover them ending abruptly at the water's edge. No bodies, no gear. The tracks simply stopped. The OSS never confirmed how many of Kolbe's men perished in the wilderness. Some may have drowned crossing thin ice. Others may have evaded capture and vanished into Sweden. The snow covered all traces. Communication with London grew sporadic. Each message Kolbe sent, encoded and brief, carried mounting urgency, limited munitions. Enemy pressure increasing, continuing objective. For 2 weeks, the men lived on powdered rations and melted snow, striking when opportunity allowed. On April 13, they achieved their final success, blowing the bridge at Windtangen, severing the last usable rail connection in the north. Germany's 20th Mountain Army was effectively isolated, but victory came at a cost. In the chaos of withdrawal, one OSS patrol led by Sergeant Harold Hansen failed to return. Their last radio call mentioned enemy contact near the village of Patenblofjell. When Norwegian locals reached the site after the war, they found only the remains of a burned cabin and the charred fragments of a coded OSS field pad. Hansen's name, along with 5 others, was never recorded in official after-action reports. Presumed missing, the file reads, nothing more. By early May, the survivors of Operation Ripe were extracted across the Swedish border under cover of darkness. The war in Europe ended days later. Kolbe returned to London, silent and grim, his mission accomplished, but his team decimated. Of the 35 men who jumped, only 21 were confirmed alive. When interviewed decades later, Kolbe reflected, "It was the purest form of war. No front, no medals, just the cold and the silence." Yet mystery lingers. In declassified OSS cables from 1946, analysts noted radio interference during Ripe's final transmissions, signals coming from an unidentified source operating on Allied frequencies. The origin of those broadcasts has never been determined. Some historians believe they were German counterintelligence efforts. Others suspect an experimental Allied unit monitoring OSS traffic. A few quietly suggest the interference came from another Ripe team that was never officially acknowledged. Operation Ripe was the OSS's last combat mission in Europe, a final act of courage waged against time, terrain, and exhaustion. The bridges they destroyed hastened the collapse of Nazi control in Scandinavia, but the cost was measured not just in lives lost, but in the secrets carried into the snow. Secrets that melted away with spring and were never spoken of again. In the months that followed, as the OSS was disbanded and reborn as the CIA, the legacy of these infiltrations began to fade into the classified fog of the Cold War. But even in silence, their shadow remained, and the story of those who vanished behind enemy lines would find its haunting echo in the final chapter of the war's secret history. As the guns of World War II fell silent in the spring of 1945, victory brought both relief and reflection. But for the men of the OSS, there was no parade, no celebration, no final salute. Their battles had been fought in whispers, in the dark corners of occupied Europe, in missions so secret that even Allied commanders sometimes knew nothing of them. The world would remember Normandy and Stalingrad, but not Strasbourg, Innsbruck, or the frozen lakes of Norway. Yet behind those forgotten fronts lay the story of how intelligence, deception, and sacrifice shaped the very end of the war. And, vanished into history, the Office of Strategic Services had been born from desperation, a creation of necessity when the United States entered the war unprepared for global espionage. By 1945, it had become an invisible army of more than 13,000 men and women scattered across Europe and Asia. They had infiltrated enemy governments, rescued prisoners, and sabotaged vital infrastructure. Their successes were measured not in ground gained, but in secrets stolen and lives saved. But the cost was steep. Many operatives never returned. Their names were omitted from rosters, their missions sealed. Their families told only that they were missing in action. Among the fallen were the teams from Operation Alsos, whose pursuit of Germany's atomic secrets ended in unexplained disappearances in the Vosges. The Jedburgh agents, dropped into occupied France, who led local resistance uprisings but vanished under Gestapo interrogation. The rescuers of EMAD Operation Halyard, caught in the politics of Balkan betrayal. The mountain ghosts of Operation Greenup, who braved the Austrian Alps to spy on the Reich's final defenses. And the frostbitten survivors of Operation Ripe, who struck the Nazis' last northern stronghold and left behind comrades who were never found. Each of these operations had its triumphs, but together they formed something larger, a tapestry of secrecy that stretched from the laboratories of Berlin to the snowfields of Scandinavia. In post-war Europe, as Allied and Soviet forces divided the continent, the OSS became a ghost organization. Its officers were ordered to destroy their field notes, their ciphers, and sometimes even their memories. The veil of silence descended quickly. When the OSS was dissolved in October 1945, replaced by the I Strategic Services Unit, much of its wartime intelligence vanished with it. Even decades later, historians trying to piece together the full record of OSS infiltrations face blank pages and missing files. Operation reports that should have contained daily logs stopped abruptly mid-sentence. Personnel lists bore blacked-out names. One internal memo, dated May 1946, read simply, "Certain European assets remain unaccounted for. Recommend indefinite classification." The phrase European assets was widely interpreted as referring to OSS agents who had disappeared without trace. Some families of those missing men never stopped asking questions. A few received anonymous letters years later, fragments of maps, faded photographs, even personal trinkets mailed from post-war Austria or Yugoslavia. Whether these were cruel hoaxes or hidden messages has never been determined. But to intelligence officers who served during that time, such mysteries were unsurprising. The OSS had become, in many ways, a victim of its own secrecy. A web of shadows so intricate that even its architects could no longer see all its threads. In the years following the war, former OSS members helped shape the new American intelligence community. William Donovan, the OSS founder, called for a permanent organization to handle global espionage. From his vision emerged the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947. Among its early leaders were veterans of these wartime infiltrations, men like William Colby, who carried lessons from the frozen mountains of Norway into the Cold War's covert conflicts. Yet even they spoke rarely, if ever, of the OSS missions that preceded them. When Colby testified before Congress decades later, he mentioned Operation Ripe only in passing. It was the essence of intelligence, he said, to fight unseen and to disappear. His words might well have served as the epitaph for the entire OSS. Today, a single wall in Leipzig, CIA headquarters at Langley, bears a silent memorial, a field of carved stars representing agents who died in the line of duty. Many remain unnamed. Among them are believed to be the men and women who perished on OSS infiltrations across Europe. Their stories are buried beneath layers of classification, half remembered in old reports or lost entirely to the fires of post-war bureaucracy. Still, fragments surface. A diary found in an Austrian farmhouse, a coded cable declassified half a century later, a testimony from a villager who remembers a man in Allied uniform vanishing into the forest. Together, they hint at the invisible front. The war fought in silence, where courage was measured in secrecy and survival meant erasure. And so, the OSS faded not in defeat, but in disappearance. Their infiltrations were some of the most dangerous and consequential operations ever undertaken behind enemy lines, acts of extraordinary bravery that altered the course of history without ever claiming credit for it. But their legacy endures in every modern covert operation, every intelligence mission conducted in the shadows. The echoes of OSS, Jedburgh, Halyard, Greenup, and Ripe live on, reminders that the war was won not only on the battlefield, but in the invisible war of spies, saboteurs, and ghosts. In the end, the OSS left behind no victory parade, no medals for the fallen, only questions. Who betrayed the Jedburghs? What happened to the missing Alsos team in Strasbourg? Where did Captain Lalich's plane fall? And who, if anyone, still knows the truth? The answers lie somewhere between history and silence, hidden perhaps forever behind enemy lines.